Welcome to Good Books Radio. I'm Dr. W.F. Strong. I am your host this week. And this week we have a wonderful guest, Eric Kaplan, who's written a book appropriate for Christmas, Does Santa Exist? And we're going to talk to him in just a minute, but I first want to thank our sponsor, audiobooks.com. Audiobooks.com offers you your first book free. You go there, sign up, become a member, and you get your first book free. And you can stay on board for about $14 a month, and you get a free, well, not a free book, but it buys you a book each month. I belong to a wonderful service. I highly recommend it. Our guest today, Eric Kaplan, he's written, as I said, a book called Does Santa Exist? And he has an impressive history in comedic writing. He is right now a writer for The Big Bang Theory, which is the #1 show on TV, I believe. We'll ask about that. And he's written for David Letterman, Futurama, and Flight of the Conchords. And he's currently working on his PhD dissertation in philosophy, of all things, at UC Berkeley. Welcome, Eric. How are you today?
I'm terrific. Thanks for having me on the program.
My first question is, how do you become a comedy writer? How do you get that gig?
Oh, how do you get the gig?
Yeah.
Well, my first interview was with at David Letterman's show, and I went in there, and Rob Burnett, who was the executive producer at the time, interviewed me, and I had written a writing sample and all that, and he said, I have one question for you. Are you funny? So the wheels turned in my head a little bit, and I said yes. And then I didn't say anything else because I thought that would be a funny answer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got that, by a certain amount of brazen taciturnity. I just said yes. So that's how I got my first gig, and then I kind of jumped from show to show after that.
Are most of the writers on Big Bang Theory, are they people that are endowed with big degrees and esoteric subjects? No,
they aren't. They're people who have a passion for writing and comedy and television and entertainment, and it's rare that I have this esoteric background.
Mm-hmm.
It's a weird career because people come to it by all kind of different paths.
Can you teach someone comedy, or do you just have to be born with it in your genes?
That's a question I don't know the answer to. I would think it has to do with your early childhood experiences more than your genes. Mm-hmm. I think it probably has to do with a certain defense mechanism against emotional pain.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine if you don't do that at all, if you're simply a happy fella or lady, you probably cannot learn it. But if you have some part of that in you, which most people do, you can develop it. How's that? That's unfortunately a very boring answer, but I think it might be accurate.
I think it is, because if you look back at the lives of people like Richard Pryor, he had a hell of a childhood, and there's a lot of ones that we can point to that had considerable angst in their younger years, and covered it with humor, no doubt.
Yeah. A friend of mine, I won't give the person, but a friend of mine said about a prominent comedian, he compared it to a character in the Iliad known as Philoctetes. And I guess Philoctetes had this horrible suppurating wound that smelled really bad, so he was unable to get close to anybody. So he became really good at firing a bow and arrow as a way of reaching people. And I think there's something in that, in the psychological makeup of a lot of comedians, that they simultaneously have a way of distancing people so as to not get hurt, but then have developed this sort of hypertrophic wit that connects with people from a distance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is also part of the, when you and I write the psychological underpinnings of comedy, that's probably going to be a chapter, this notion of protection, but also connection, self-protection and connection.
I remember when I was talking to you off air about my background in Twain, and the first time that I came across his writings when I was about well, I'd come across him in the fourth grade and stuff. But when I came across him later, when I was reading Roughing It, and I connected the dots and said, "Oh, this is that same guy," you know. And it was the first time I came across what I would call literary comedy, where I found sentences so funny I would fall out of bed, you know, reading them, and it was such a delightful discovery to find that comedy could be that beautiful, really, you know, that artistic.
The first thing I read, I had this book of the history of American comedy, and it was sort of like boring thing from the 18th century, boring thing that's not funny, things that's not funny, and then it had James Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses by Twain.
Yes.
And I couldn't stop laughing. I was like, whoa, okay, someone who's actually funny. That's amazing. Did he invent it? And then later on I learned, like, okay, you know, I think Lawrence Stern is funny, and I think Rabelais is funny, but on the American scene, it sort of seems like it's a bunch of weird, sleepy, serious people pretending to be funny, and then suddenly Twain jumps on the stage, and you're like, okay, now I'm actually laughing.
And then where do you go from there?
Also like Bierce. Do you like Bierce?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And Will Rogers.
My dad used to read me Oil of Dog as a child, which is it's a funny thing to do because it's about parenticide.
And then do you go, take me forward. Who's next on your chronological list?
Oh, funny people?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not a historian. I like when we start getting into Benchley and Thurber. I think that's really funny. And then, you know, the Marx Brothers and Fields are really funny. There's this weird guy named, I think his name is Grossmith, who wrote this book called Diary of a Nobody, who are funny. I think Gilbert and Sullivan are really funny, actually. And then for me, then the next kind of huge turn is Monty Python. Like when I first encountered Monty Python, I suddenly felt like a cave fish first exposed to the sun. I was just like, wow, I didn't know my brain could absorb this much oxygen. This is amazing. And I had the good fortune to meet Cleese once, and I said, look, it seems to me, because I was sort of like, okay, I don't care if I'm going to seem like a dork. I have this weird opportunity to meet an idol of mine. I said, look, it seems to me that there's this kind of spiritual agenda behind Monty Python, that you're sort of trying to get people to open up their minds to more possibilities. And he said, that's absolutely true. So I was like, oh, that's pretty good.
I loved his explanation for Fawlty Towers once, where he said the whole philosophy behind Fawlty Towers is that we could run this hotel perfectly if it weren't for the damn guests. Yeah. He's a heavy guy. You know, he went through he went through psychology. He started to be psychoanalyzed, and he realized that he felt that all his humor was just anger. It was just like a lot of people walking into rooms and shouting at people, which is kind of an unfair view of himself. But I thought that was interesting. And then he decided he was going to try and make the workplace a better place, and he did these instructional videos about how people talk in the workplace. I saw those, and I was so shocked when I first saw them. Yeah, they're good. They're very good for, you know, organizational behavior and things like that. They have great lessons, and they do it, of course, with humor.
Yeah. I'm sure they have. I mean, he's a super smart guy, and I was just impressed that he has this kind of himself has this kind of like questing spiritual aspect to him.
I was so happy in your book that you had the cheese shop, because that's one of my favorite all-time comedic skits. Is of course you're looking at his philosophical implications, but I just love that particular little vignette in there. It's beautiful.
It's amazing, and the sketch is amazing. I'm not saying what I wrote about it was amazing, no, but the sketch is amazing. And one of the weird things about the book is when I'm talking about Plato, I can be funny, but then when I'm talking about the cheese shop, it's very hard to be funny because it's already funny.
It's already funny.
So I sometimes that tends to be more serious, but then I can kind of squeeze in. But that's a more difficult job, to be funny about something that's already funny.
It is, and then as soon as you, like you point out in the book, that whenever you start overanalyzing humor, you have taken away all the capacity for it to be funny.
Right, right. And I think that's interesting. I think that kind of lets us know that our minds are involved in time in a way that, some philosophers thought they weren't. But to take somebody who's, I guess he may have been a contemporary of Twain's, the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. And he says that a thought is inherently pointed towards the future. And I think that comedy kind of gives us a clue that that's the case, that it's always kind of sending us towards something that we cannot quite articulate or quite explain.
You rarely meet comedians who are conservative. Most of them are kind of liberal thinkers and pushing forward, like you say. Mm-hmm. Like Twain came from a very conservative age, but he was very critical about the hypocrisy of that age, the Gilded Age, and he was for women's rights. He was for the women's right to vote. He was, of course, against slavery from the time he was little. He was for all the liberal causes of his age and used his wit to prove the case. Yeah. Now, let me give you something
I think that's true.
Let me give you something he said, and you play with it. He said that comedy or humor is in the manner of the telling, not the matter.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, because if you think about it, it goes back to the thing I was trying to say about time, which is if I say, I'm trying to think of just like a boneheaded joke. Like, okay, here's a dumb one. Two psychiatrists meet in the street, and one of them says, "You're fine. How am I?" So let's say that that's funny. But if I say there's psychiatrists, sometimes they know someone else better than they know themselves. Mm-hmm. And here's an example of it. One of these two psychiatrists met in the street, and one of them said, "You're fine." He didn't say, "I'm fine." He said, "You're fine." And then he said, "How am I?" Well, now it's not funny at all, because it's sort of like comedy almost is like it takes you off balance and then it gives you your balance back. Mm-hmm. But if I say, "I'm about to send you off balance," then you're not going to be off balance and it's not going to be funny. So I mean, not surprisingly, Mark Twain was right.
Well,
and we've learned that on the radio today.
One of the things he's talking about, of course, is developing a persona that's funny. And I think in Big Bang Theory, of course, Sheldon's persona is, the kind of linchpin of the comedy. If it weren't for his carefully developed persona, then you couldn't do so much.
Right. It's funny that it's too bad. Did Mark Twain ever write a play?
He did. In fact, Tom Sawyer was originally written to be a play, and then he.
No kidding.
Yeah. In fact, if you'll read the first page, you can see that it's like a play. The dialogue.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And then he gave up on it that way and went on to other things. But he has great dialogue. You could see him writing a sitcom because he's really wonderful with dialogue. He used to say that he had a phonographic memory, that he remembered accents and dialects really, really well.
That's interesting. Yeah, you think about like the Duke and the King episode from
Huckleberry Finn. Now, when you're writing for Big Bang Theory, do writers kind of take? Do you have somebody who does Sheldon all the time, or does anybody write for Sheldon?
Well, no. I mean, that's a little bit like, like when you're painting a picture, it wouldn't make sense that there's somebody who does the blue all the time, because, where the blue goes is going to depend upon where the green goes and where the black goes. So these things kind of come together dialogically. That's okay. Like you'd say that like Sheldon is who he is in interaction with Leonard and in interaction with Amy and interaction with Penny. So these scenes kind of build themselves up from the way people rub against one another. I don't mean that in a dirty sense, although sometimes I do, but I just mean.
So do you sit around with the writers and synergistically create these scenes?
Yes. Yes, it's weird. It's weird. I've never worked on a show like this before, but we actually sit down at a group and we put it all together as a group. Like we just literally okay, what does the first person say? And one person will pitch a joke, and someone else will pitch a joke, and someone else will pitch a joke, and then someone will come up with a joke that makes everybody laugh, and it'll be kind of like, okay, that's a funny joke. Does that work? Does that make sense? Is that going to put us into a "Have we done it before?"
Is that an old joke?
And in that way, we build the scene, or we'll have a little path, and we'll just like, well, we know Sheldon's upset. Should he come in and say he's upset? Should he pretend that he's not upset and do that for a couple lines? And then if he does do that, what's going to make him say that he's upset? So we'll have these little roadmaps, but we do write it as a group.
And then do you have some? I'm sure this happens that you just say, "Oh, that's wonderful, but we can't use it." Like it's over the top. It's politically incorrect. It's just
Well, we don't care so much about politically incorrect. I mean, if it's over the top in the sense that it just seems like a person wouldn't really do that, even if it's funny, we won't do it. Like it's our show is a different kind of comedy than Monty Python. It's supposed to have the texture of real life. So even though these are extreme characters, they're supposed to be ones that are psychologically have verisimilitudinous. There's characters who are psychologically verisimilitudinous. So we strike for that verisimilitudinousitude, and that means we won't do something even if it's hilarious because it's not, it wouldn't really happen.
Is there any time in television history that this kind of show has been possible before? I mean, a kind of celebration of egg-headedness. Is there any place? I don't know of any show in the history of television that was like this, or if it was, it didn't have this much success. So why now?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like new ground. I think we've kind of reached a tipping point in history where there's a lot of people who are highly intelligent, socially awkward, poor dressers, and I think it's kind of the show's a global phenomenon. And one of the things I realize is that supposing you're in some country that's ruled by warlords who go around the town with a jeep and machine guns, those warlords have to have a computer. And that computer has to have a guy who helps the computer work for the warlord when he can't figure out how to load it. He can't figure out how to send an email. He needs to get his guy. So that guy will like our show, even though he grows up in a country that's rather different from ours. There's still that class of technical experts, and I think they have the same kind of, well, I'm so smart, how come the warlord is getting the girl and I'm not?
Well, do you have this show I had never thought of it until just this moment, but I'm sure it runs in other countries. It's been translated, right?
Yes, it's all over the world. It's huge in Latin America. It's huge in Russia and in France, and it's downloaded illegally in China. It's pretty exciting. It's this kind of episode in the global consciousness.
Well, they say that humor is one of the hardest things to translate across cultures, but obviously it's working.
Yeah, it seems that there's certain kinds of humor that are possible to translate across cultures, and there must be others that aren't. That I was speaking to a Japanese friend of mine about humor, and she sent me this whole list of Japanese jokes, and it was hard to identify why they were jokes. She says there's the humor of pretending to kidnap somebody. I was like, well, why are you using the word joke to apply to that? That's weird. But I'm sure there are some things from Japan that are funny. I saw a Japanese comic book once that it involved, this guy pooping, and it looked exactly like a soft serve ice cream. I was like, okay, that's pretty funny.
I would imagine that. The humor that wouldn't translate obviously would be those that are based on wordplay that only work in one language, and they're untranslatable. Because the wordplay isn't similar in the other language, but in terms of characterization and persona, then we kind of have a world youth culture, so I would assume that Sheldon is translatable.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of social situations that are common, like the notion of a guy who's caught between his mom and his newlywed wife. That seems to be something that's common in many cultures, but not all. If there's some culture where everybody lives together in a big hamster pile, and they're not going to like that humor because they won't relate to it.
Tell me about your book. What is the thesis, the agenda of your book? Why did you write it?
Well, I had this experience that my son had a play date with a friend of his when he was 5 years old, and it was at the zoo, and it was in December, and his friend's mother called me up and said that she didn't she wanted to cancel the play date because there were going to be reindeer at the zoo, and they would discuss Santa Claus. Not the reindeer, but the children would discuss Santa Claus, and that would my son did not believe in Santa Claus, and he would tell that to his friend who would stop believing in Santa Claus, and she thought that was a terrible thing, and she didn't want that to happen. And I thought that was weird, and I thought, like, well, she's sacrificing her son's relationship with someone who exists, who presumably my son existed, for someone who didn't exist.
I love that.
Claus presumably didn't exist.
I love that point. When I read it in the book, I said that's a great point. Sacrificing the real for the unreal.
For the fantasy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, well, maybe I'm being uncharitable here. And how do I know Santa Claus does not exist? Is it because I've never met him? Well, no, because I've never met supermodel Bar Raffaelli, but she exists. And is it because if I went to the North Pole, I wouldn't find him? Well, no, because I'm not a polar explorer, and if I tried to be, I'd probably kill myself, and I would miss a lot of things. And they're like, well, what if someone tried to go there with a drone robot? Well, what if his beard gives out some kind of a ray which warps time and space, so photons can't bounce off of him? So there could be no pictures of him. It doesn't mean he doesn't exist. Well, what if somebody met him, but it could be that the elves performed some kind of brain surgery that caused amnesia, so they would never remember him. So just the fact that I cannot prove that he exists doesn't mean that he doesn't exist. And then it led me to thinking about other things that I might believe in, even though I can't prove they don't exist. And, one of them is Eric Kaplan. Like, in physics, there's no discussion of Eric Kaplan. I'm just muons and puons like everything else. There's no sense in which the part of the world that's me is different from the part of the world that's not me. But if you try and take your part of the world, which is your Ford Explorer, and drive it through me, I'm really going to be unhappy about that. So there are certainly contexts where I believe very formidably that I exist and want to keep existing, and then there's other contexts like science where it doesn't seem that I exist at all. So maybe I'm the same as Santa Claus. Maybe there's this weird sense in which there are things that I believe in some sense and don't believe in another sense, and that's what I wanted to talk about in the book. Mm-hmm. That's what motivated me.
Is your dissertation based upon this?
Yeah, the dissertation is based on comedy as an approach to contradiction, because Aristotle said that nothing can be P and not P at the same time and in the same respect, and I think he was wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think comedy is a way of letting us see how certain things can be, life can be serious but also ridiculous. A pig can be both a pet and also bacon.
Good point.
Santa Claus can exist and also not exist. So that's the burden of the dissertation. Although the dissertation, as it's an academic work, has to be unenjoyable to write and read.
Yes. You got
a requirement of the academic industry.
Got to have some serious tone to it. So you got to.
Well, you have to prove that you've suffered, and you have to also cause your readers to suffer. Otherwise, it's just entertainment.
Well, I tell you, when I did my dissertation on Twain, I was very appreciative of him because, as you know, a dissertation is drudgery, and it's nice to be entertained as you go through it all.
Right. Yeah, it is drudgery.
What other show would you like to write for? I mean, not trying to get you in trouble with your job, but if you could write for some other show, like Walking Dead, for instance, bring a little comedy to the show, what show would you like to write for?
Let me think. I'd like to write for girls. Mm-hmm. I think it'd be interesting to write for all those female characters, and I think Lena Dunham is a super brain, super good writer. It'd be cool to learn something from her.
Do you write for girls well?
I try to. As I've gotten older, I sort of feel a little bit more like an androgyne. Like I feel more like I have female and male aspects within me. But I think I could certainly learn to do that more. I find that very interesting. I find the whole fact that there's two genders very interesting and kind of hard to wrap my head around.
If you were going to teach a class in college on comedy, comedic writing, let's say, what would be some of the rules that you would tell your students? Say, okay, to write comedy, you need to do this and this and this, and don't do this and this.
How to write it.
Yeah, how to write.
I think I would say you should find something that you genuinely care about and confused about, and kind of dwell in that confusion. I think I would do that, but I suspect it might also be the kind of thing that you learn by doing rather than by theorizing about. You know, it would almost be more like a dance class than a chemistry class. Like, you know, chemistry class, you would break the reactions down into components and, you know, put them back together. But in a dance class, presumably you just do it and do it and do it until you get good at it. And I think a comedy class might be more like that.
When I've seen people try to write funny material, they just sit down and try to write a funny story. The thing I see that's the weakness often is they overwrite it. It's go back to the fundamental law that brevity is the soul of wit. Good tight lines. You know, you read Woody Allen or watch his movies, and they're just beautifully tight lines. He doesn't beat you over the head with the point. He just makes it and goes on.
It's true. It's true. You do want to get through things quickly. It's a funny thing, though, that piece you just quoted was in the mouth of a prolix bore, Polonius in Hamlet. He says, since brevity is the soul of wit and tediousness its limbs and outward forms, I will be brief. And then he is not brief at all.
And he's not brief. The book is Does Santa Exist by Eric Kaplan, who is a writer for The Big Bang Theory and soon to be Dr. Kaplan, I'm sure.
Available wherever fine salamis are sold. Nice to meet you.
I want to thank audiobooks.com, who is our underwriter, where your first book is free. Signing off for Good Books Radio, I'm Dr. W.F. Strong. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.